For starters, I'm Christy Tabai. I'm with the TOPS program. It's great to see some newer faces in the room. It's always great to see people who have been a part of TOPS for quite a while. I love the mix. Lauren Jessup, who is listed as Adrian on the webinar, who is not Adrian, but is Lauren. I don't know if you will go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm the program associate for TOPS.
It provides a lot of support and feedback and input for TOPS as well. We'll just take a quick minute to go around the room to do introductions. And just in case anyone else is online and you wish to speak up, feel free. Otherwise, you can feel free to lurk. We are being recorded, so this can be watched later, but we will send out some notes. So we'll go ahead and start. Chloe, if you want to go ahead.
I am Chloe Banks. I work for World Vision as a program manager. I'm Camilla Studer. I work for CDI MoCA, the project assistant in the operations department. My name is Mira Russell, and I'm Director of Food Security for CARE.
My name is Rebecca Bakewood. I'm a Senior Project Coordinator at CDI MoCA. Also in the support division, I support projects in Kyrgyzstan and the Philippines.
Chelsea Renberg with Project Concern International, and I'm a project coordinator for the humanitarian aid and food security department.
Great. So we're going to make this a little less formal. Just a few housekeeping points. Wi-Fi code is up there. Please use it, especially as we're talking through some of these points. If we say something, you think about a resource comes to mind, or we mention a resource and you want to look it up, do it. This is really, I'm trying to call this a workshop so we get some a chance to really kind of get our hands dirty a bit, mostly with pizza rather than dirt, but that's okay. As I mentioned, the restrooms are by the elevators, so you need to go back around out the front door. There's probably an easier way this way. We have doors on both sides, but you'll need the fob, so please grab the fob. They're in the hallway with the elevators. This workshop is the first of, I believe, about 5, I think is what we're going to end up holding. We're splitting, the reason that we're having 5 is that during the Fanta gender analysis workshop that took place at the end of July, there were 4 questions that were put on the wall, and it was part of an exercise that took place towards the end, on the last day of the workshop. And people wanted to have the opportunity to explore those questions a little bit more. I know some of you were present at the workshop. Some of you might have seen the notes that came out from the workshop. Some of you may not have been there at all, and that's okay. But we wanted to kind of dig a little bit deeper into these 4 questions in order to have a little more conversation. Some of the groups examined different questions, and we didn't really get a chance to dig a little bit deeper, and that's okay. So we're going to do that. We're going to start to do that today. The reason that we're thinking, even though there were 4 questions, we're going to have 5 workshops, because this question that we're going to work on today actually talks about theory of change. People have a lot of questions about theory of change. I have a lot of questions about theory of change. It's big, it's complicated, there's a lot of questions involved with it, and to try and fit a discussion around theory of change exclusively alongside with the other pieces we're going to talk about is a little overwhelming, and I don't want to keep you here for the rest of the afternoon. So we're going to split that into another workshop topic in a couple of weeks. So the beauty of TOPS being now a 7-year program, and we're in year 7 of 7, is that there's been changes that from Food for Peace in terms of what they've required for gender integration in the programs. And they've also, the conversation has changed, the requirements have changed, and we know that people have gone in and out of the conversation. So we know that this conversation for some people is one that is well entrenched into their daily work, and for others, they're really just learning more about how things are being done, what are the requirements. So we know there's a variety of experience in the room, and I think it's reflective of the fact that gender is becoming more integrated into a lot of the work that we're doing. It's great to see as a result of USA's updated gender strategy in 2012, their policy. So I would encourage you, if you have questions, you're not really sure, you don't have a lot of background on where some of these pieces came from, please ask, or send a follow-up email, and feel free to shoot off some questions, and we can all fill in the pieces. This is going to be, I'm going to be a little bit reactive to how things are working in the room. The series is a little free-form, so if something isn't working out, we'll change it. If people want to explore another topic a little bit more, we can do that, but we'll just be a little bit more reactive rather. The proactive part is setting these workshops up, but the reactive part is kind of adjusting to what our needs are as a group. And we'll have, I imagine, different people participating at each session, so it'll be a little bit different.
Is the series broken out like every like twice a month, once a month, or is there not really a set schedule as of right now?
There's not really a set schedule right now, mostly due to travel schedules and other obligations. This is an impromptu event thrown into our Year 7 work plan, and that's a lot how TOPS works. So we're just going to, we're hoping to do something about every 2 to 3 weeks. We don't want this to drag on. We know that there's going to be eventually a live RFA out there for the next round of DFAPs, and we know that other DFAPs are getting implemented pretty soon. So we want to try and move this along and have this conversation ideally before, we'd like to finish up before January or February and not interfere with other types of, but we'll see. But this is why it's recorded, and so if people aren't able to make one, they're at least able to listen online, and we can always continue a conversation on the FSN network or through email as well. Never a finished conversation. So I've talked a little bit about the workshop objective, which is up there, and it's basically to have a little more dialogue about the gender analysis process. And we're specifically focusing on Food for Peace development food assistant programs, but I'm sure that you've done some work with other programs as well. And we will focus on this first question, which is, what do you not know about the gender context that can impede or facilitate progress along the project theory of change? And as I said, there's really a lot within that particular question, and so we're going to focus on the gender context piece of it, and look at the theory of change in more depth in another session. That doesn't mean that we can't talk about it or bring up questions. I just went there.
So,
Yeah.
So in doing that, I was just wondering if we wanted to first maybe define what the gender context is.
Could you go
what
to
we think it is, or if there is a definition that
So-
anybody knows of.
We're completely on the same page because that's basically the next piece of it. So how are we defining gender context? And I've put up some ideas there, but I'm going to note ideas down here, and we can talk about this a little bit more. So it's multi-layered. We're talking about national policies, cultural norms in a program area, participants, partners, and stakeholders, organizational policies and norms, program tone, supportive, neutral via activities as well as staff, and are there other pieces to take into consideration in defining the gender context? So I don't know if is there a formal definition that anybody, I feel like it could be everything in the kitchen sink. That's what that feels like up there. Does anybody have thoughts in addition to what's up there, or is there another detail around it?
My perspective is that I think it involves all of it, but then what you focus on depends on what the project is targeting, or, so like, you do need to be mindful of the national policies when you're looking at a business program or economic development program, but you might not directly, get involved in that, but you need to be mindful of those as well, like how gender plays out, how the, across all layers throughout the entire, enabling environment. Then what the project actually focuses on or actually addresses would be, more narrow or more focused, like beneficiaries or, if they have access to markets, things like that.
So in other words, for example, we would, if we're looking at a markets program, we would look at some of the, in some cases, there's some policies may have women integrated into Ministry of Ag documents around value chains that the country itself wants to really focus on. In other cases, it may not, and those policies may help with the implementation of the program, but the program isn't necessarily going to be working on gender policies at the value chain function within the government or something like that. Yeah.
Your theory of change will help you to narrow that, right?
Yeah. Well,
maybe. I kind of see it, as sort of an iterative process, because one thing leads into the other in certain respects, because you take the context and you build the theory of change based on the context, and then you go back and reference the context to refine your theory of change at some point, whether at the beginning or at some point within the program. So, but I'm just kind of wondering to what extent, when you think about the gender context, you're thinking about the context as a whole and how gender fits into it. You really, almost I get the feeling you would have to be looking at the context in general. And I like the idea of it being multi-layered, definitely. But we would be looking at the context anyway within that multi-layered kind of framework.
Did you have a comment? Oh. One piece that I think we maybe think about less when we think about gender context is the organizational policies and norms and program tone piece. The program tone piece, I think, can be, first of all, it's difficult to determine at the start of a program because, well, we're at the beginning, nobody really has a good feel for it, but a chief of party and other staff can set a tone of, look, we're going to be gender inclusive, we're going to be, gender transformative, the message there won't be I don't think anyone really says we're going to be gender blind in this program, but there definitely can be that sense of, whether gender is going to be a focus from the level of the COP and whether or not that actually flows through the rest of the program. And of course, that will change based on changes in staff as well, the dynamics. And we don't talk about that as much because that's often more internal, but it plays a huge role into whether or not gender advisors are supported within the program, whether the right questions are being asked during times when we're revisiting project plans, ARRs, and reporting to the donor. But also organizational policy and norms play a role as well. So if in certain country offices, I'm sure you've experienced, or in certain places, there's a really strong push towards gender inclusion. I feel that way. I feel that Bangladesh is one of the countries where there's a lot of discussion and talk, and there may be other countries where it's not that high on within, it's not a dialogue that takes place at multiple levels. So the country office doesn't necessarily absorb some of that as well.
I agree with you. I think I would just add it also depends on the donor initiative.
Yeah, that's very true.
Or, and a specific mission that you're dealing with in the country. So you would hope that all of them would be mindful and sensitive, to the gender needs and constraints,
Consistent,
but
yeah.
and consistent. But that's not always the case. So maybe maybe the project might want to have that tone. The organization might have that gender policies in place. But if the donor doesn't want it, or if the donor doesn't want to focus resources, personnel and monetary into focusing on gender, it's not.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
The donor.
I would also say that a lot also depends on the institutional context in the country itself. For instance, I was really pleased to see that several years ago there was a woman appointed as as Minister of Agriculture in Rwanda, and he conducted a full-scale gender analysis of the agriculture sector. And there are not many places where you would see that done, but it made a huge difference.
I was just recently looking for climate change policies that included a gender aspect, and not every country has a gender or a climate change policy, and I didn't really find any, and it doesn't mean they don't exist because I didn't go through all of them, but I didn't find one that actually had mentioned. In some cases, it said linked to gender policy, country, the national gender policy. So that was how they were linking the two together, but it wasn't explicitly stated within the policy. So, yeah, absolutely. I think depending on who is really in those positions, it really makes a difference. Is there any other pieces that we'd like to talk about in terms of how we're defining gender context?
The cultural context that you mentioned is very important. The cultural, social, and cultural norms. But one thing also to keep in mind with that is not just what that those things are not static and that they change. So I think it's important to understand what is the current context, what is the past context, how does it shift back and forth, and what are the differences also generationally for different people. So gender norms may be different from older people than from younger people.
Yeah, I had two thoughts on it. Like, one was the age that sometimes it can be different depending on the ages, and the other, just thinking about, like, right now we're reading through our draft gender analysis report for Bangladesh, and in some of the communities, so they're predominantly Hindu, we see a lot more empowerment for women than where they're predominantly Muslim, even though they are pretty close to each other, but just the religion has a huge impact. So I would say that along with culture. Or maybe it's just something about.
That's a really neat observation.
But just thinking a little deeper and wanted to add to this discussion is that in Kyrgyzstan, because of the history of the country, if you ever ask, either a man or a woman, do you feel like men and women are equal? The answer is always yes, because men and women are equal. But that's just, of course, that's the answer. But then if you actually dive deeper into the behaviors of men and women, their different access to resources, how they behave, they're not equal. They definitely have discrete norms. Women cook, men go out and do the job, they work. So again, it falls on the lines of very traditional gender roles, but if you ask them verbally, they will not acknowledge that. So there's this part of the culture is that you have to realize, again, the context that you're working with, and there's even a recognition from the local staff beneficiaries that there is a gender issue.
Yeah. What I was going to mention on that, too, is, like, the definition. I think the definition is where it could get gray. Somebody would define gender in this part of the region as one thing, But then in this other part, they define gender as something completely different. So not only the norms or the practices, but how they define it verbally or what they view it as, not just their actions, which is exactly along those lines.
Do you have an example?
So I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Zambia, and when you talk about gender, there's that confusion of sex versus gender. There's that confusion of, okay, women do this, but yes, they can do it, but is it something they do on a regular basis? No, or same for the men. So when you ask them, what is gender? They say, oh, it's a female. Or if you ask them, what is a gender role? They say, it's something that people do, but they don't explicitly define it's a man's role, it's a woman's role. It's something that somebody does. So I think just there's that gray line between any definition. Somebody could put their own take or word in it that changes how it's viewed or defined.
That's what makes this whole conversation even more confusing, because it's just because, how something happens in one place doesn't mean that's how it happens in another place.
Yeah.
I mean, the Kyrgyzstan example is something I never even thought of, but it's obvious. And then in Zambia, and of course language. How does local language play a role in that as well?
There's not a
In most
word.
places, in most places, people do not have a word for gender. They just say gender or something, and they maybe know what it means, but it's kind of hard.
Right. Okay, so if we feel like we've looked at this first question, we'll go ahead and move on. Any other final comments? Okay, okay, so I broke this down into the who, what, when, where, how, and why, right? So when do we need to know this information about gender context? We know that, for example, if we could, we would always be able to have an updated, ongoing situational analysis, which would include understanding the gender context within a country, and that someone would be able to be on top of that, have that information, understand it for every country where we have programming, so that when we actually go to design a program, that information is ready for us. That's probably not how it really works.
I mean, you have FuseNet. You know what the current, the IPC levels are.
Sure.
Sure. There are those things where it is possible to know those things. We don't have like an IPC for gender. We don't define what that is. So we're a little bit we're a little bit like creating sort of what we think is important and not important when it comes to the gender context.
It goes back to the comment about, that these norms are changing. They can go, I think about when that comment was said, the first thing I thought about was Afghanistan and Iran. Before the revolution, people dressed differently, religion was approached in a different manner, and then, after we saw the revolution, for example, in Iran, then we see people changing their clothes, and so we see these shifts and changes, and with that come, for some people, those not only the physical appearance changes, but some of their ideology, has changed as well based off of whatever the current situation is. But at the same time, some people may go in the opposite direction. So,
but isn't there a women's empowerment index that exists?
For the WIA,
not the WIA, but there's something that's sort of more general as Women's Empowerment Index.
I don't know. I'm not sure.
There is sort of a rating system, though, in terms of, I forget what it is, but it's like the Human Development Index for gender.
The data is really not that developed yet. They've only started collecting data in 2010.
What's it called?
The gender G. I forget the name, but it is by the same people that developed the Human Development Index.
Yeah.
It's limited and it's constrained to the knowledge that the people that develop the Human Development Index have. So
Okay.
we don't have anything beyond 2000 or before 2010.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
That's
available data is-
interesting, though. I mean, and in terms of how people define the gender context and measure it. So through the WIA, there are certain things. Through these other measures, there are certain things. That might be a good way to kind of begin. I'm not saying that's going to provide an overall view of the gender context, but it helps.
It's called GII, Gender Equality Index.
Yeah. So it helps to kind of begin, or, you know, when you're going into.
It's
a
a starting
situation.
point, but it still needs a lot of development, and it needs people to actually understand how it's necessary to collect data and how to use it.
Have you done work on it or worked with it? Or
Yes.
You sound very.
I used the data for my master's thesis, or tried to, and understood then that it was very lacking.
So is this what we're looking at up here? It's very.
Yes. So that is basically explaining how they came up with the numbers. So they can explain to you how they came to the numbers. When you look into the numbers themselves,
Mm-hmm.
there's not much. And there's only certain countries, and there are numbers missing, and blocks, chunks within countries that are missing. So you can't really do much with it. But it is a starting point.
Is this done by UNDP, or am I just looking at a page that has?
No, it is. It's
Okay.
it's the same people that developed the Human Development Index.
It's the World Bank. Yeah, no? I mean, okay, maybe it is.
I think it's the UNDP.
It's the UNDP.
And I think every year they release the annual report
They do really
and the
good
ranking
annual
of the
report.
country.
The good way to use it is to take the HDI and then take the GII and see the lag between them
Mm.
to see how women compare to what the aggregated number is. But there isn't disaggregated functions of the HDI. That's where it's lacking. So Martha Nussbaum talks about it a lot. She's a great academic.
Because that could be a kind of good sort of starting point for developing what we say is the gender context.
I have a few other resources as well.
Mm.
They're at the end of those.
Okay.
But I think it's good for us to we'll just throw them out there, and if we have some repeats, it's fine by me. But this is not on my list. Okay, so just in terms of this particular question, we know that organizational experience. So if an organization has experience in a country, programming in a country, that will play a role into, what they see, especially within particular areas, because in one area of the country, I mean, it's one thing, it goes back to the mention of, Bangladesh, where you have, Hindu populations and Muslim populations, and even though they're in the same area, they're just vastly, they have some differences, not vastly different, but just differences. And then, of course, there's this option of adapting and learning over the course of the project, which is what I think most of us are doing anyways. Any other points on this piece? And just to check, we don't have anyone else on the phone, do we? Is anyone on mute? I didn't hear any beeps.
There's no one in Adobe Connect.
Okay. So let's go ahead to the next question. Okay, so who is responsible for knowing and understanding this piece around the gender context? Is it a team of people? Is it just, the rhetorical statement is it's just the gender advisor's responsibility. But who really is responsible? Some people would say, well, how deep does it really need to get? Well, we should let our ag people focus on ag.
Everybody should be focused on it. I think all the key technical advisors who lead, technical areas in the theory of change should be aware of it, and so should the project leadership. And they should be responsible for passing along information about that and how to respond to it, I think, to others within the project. So it's like everybody's job.
So the interesting thing about that, I'm actually having this issue in one of the projects I work in, where it is understood that everyone's role is to implement gender and to understand it and to be aware of it. But whenever we actually have discussions, everyone just turns to the gender specialist and they're like, oh no, she's dealing with it. She's doing something about it. So as much as we say and we reiterate the point that everyone and all the components need to take action and need to integrate gender into their components, it is not being really understood. It's not really clicking yet. So how do we go from theory to practice?
I think how to do that is each team or structure of the project needs to have targets. I mean, that's when you actually get concrete outputs. Yeah, you can say to your blue in the face that gender is responsibility of everyone, but until that technical field officer actually has to on paper verify that he has talked to 5 men and 5 women or distributed food rations to 5 men and 5 women, he's not going to do it. It's not going to be conscious in his brain, right, that he needs to do that.
Well, I think that's why you have to have the leadership of the project,
Right.
the lead technical people, completely owning and being responsible for leading the gender focus in the project. And that can involve training, that can involve other kinds of activities. I mean, I know for a project in Mali, like those guys can't go out to the field. They have to be responsible for training and supervising other folks who are going to go do that work in the field. And volunteers and so forth. So it's really critical that those people are responsible and that own, addressing gender at the field level.
I think it also helps when you can, like in those trainings, demonstrate the impact of it. So like, for example, like in the economic sector, like doing something like needing some loans or something like that. Like that has a big impact and that impacts other parts of the program. So like if you can demonstrate that to your economic staff, economic development specialists, and say like this is why this matters, help that to click in their minds, then they can take more ownership of it as opposed to thinking, oh, that's a gender thing. So then when they see like, oh, this really does help us to meet our targets, and it really does help us to achieve the program goals, it really does make a difference. Like it's not a sustainable gender thing, but it's something that's really integral.
Well, they also have to realize what the targets are and put the targets there.
And I think that happens at the beginning of a program when you have everybody, all staff in the room, understanding. I used to work with someone who said M&E is everybody's business. Everybody should understand what the targets and what the heck we're doing. And it's completely true. And I think once people have an understanding and then start, again, going, but, collectively together or work, having that leadership that will in fact trickle it down to the field level, I think that's a crucial thing in doing that.
I think it's critical also to set the right targets and to measure the right things.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of mistakes are made by not measuring what you need to measure. So that's also really
Like that can be tricky sometimes, but it's important. But sometimes you don't find until later that you are measuring exactly what that's
I know.
measuring.
Yeah.
I wanted to return to one piece of this, and that was when people look at the gender advisor and kind of go, okay, well, that's your job now, instead of taking that collective responsibility. And it feeds back to this idea of, the twin track approach of how you do gender integration and gender mainstreaming. The twin track approach is something that's advocated by a lot of donors, in that you need a targeted person, but you also need it to just be happening, because the argument is if you just do gender mainstreaming, then it's going to fall to people are just going to assume it's happening everywhere, so nobody takes on the responsibility. Kind of goes back to the target setting piece. But there's other cases. There was recently a report completed out of the UK, and I don't remember if it was through ODI or someone else, but they had mentioned that actually mainstreaming can work if it's done in a certain manner, which I thought actually included the piece around having someone who's really focused on the gender integration piece. So
I think it's from that perspective, you do need somebody who's doing that, but it has to be tailored to the theory of change. So in other words, like, and it may in fact alter the theory of change, but, and we should be open to that happening. Okay, but it has to be tailored to the technical areas, so that puts it on everybody's agenda. You almost have to come at it from that perspective, which is very, which I say, it's very risky, and you have to be very astute about it, because you have to have your feet in both what shall I say, in both domains.
why do you think it's risky?
Because, first of all, you want to make certain that you're not missing the technical objectives that you want to meet. But you have to meet them in such a way that you have broad-scale inclusive benefits if you're going to be mainstreaming gender, okay? And what that may mean is that you have to take into consideration gender issues and constraints when you're structuring your activities so that women can fully participate and benefit. And we quite often don't do that because the technical, what should I say, the technical folks out there are not thinking, how do I tailor this to ensure that I'm not causing harm in the gender arena? Okay, but you can't lose sight of the technical objective either. So, like, you don't want to say, okay, we're going to train women on, producing tomatoes. If tomatoes is not a good crop to be producing for the market, even if women want to do it, and if you don't provide them with the best technical support and ensure that they get the best technical support for it, it's almost like you're setting them up for failure. So you have to have both, take into consideration both sides, the gender side and the technical side, and figure out how to marry them. It's difficult, okay, because I've been in situations where the design went so far into gender, mostly recently since I've been at CARE, that you could not tell if there was a technical intervention in there somewhere, okay? At the same time, I've been in situations where the technical interventions were really the key thing, and then we figured out, okay, we'll put women in here somewhere. If we have time, yeah. Rather than it being, we're looking at, okay, we're looking at the technical interventions through a gender lens, and we're figuring out how to ensure that those technical interventions will have the greatest, will not cause harm in terms of gender inequality, and will benefit and provide inclusive benefits for all who are involved. And that may mean structuring things a little differently and doing things a little differently and measuring things a little differently in terms of how we do things. But do people get my?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That equilibrium it's hard.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's hard also to communicate.
I think that's even harder.
Yeah, because you're writing a proposal and you're trying to make sure, and in the long run, what sometimes happens is, okay, we're going to reach this many women because you don't have the space to do to talk about all the technical stuff, or you say, we're going to this is a gender-focused, agriculture approach, and then you don't say anything about the agriculture approach.
Or how often does it get written into proposals, but then it doesn't, it doesn't translate into the ground.
There's
what happens
that
in the
too.
integration, even though it's
Yeah.
in the work plan, right? Or vice versa. I mean, I've heard cases where there have been programs where they're midstream, they say, oh, we just realized that we really need to be targeting women on this instead of just men and women, or we need to be, there is a balance that comes in there, and then all of a sudden, once that shift takes place, and that's where I think things like, what appears to be an irrelevant indicator at the beginning of a project then becomes relevant because the focus of the activity has shifted.
And in fact, if you're doing this right, what you may see is that you have a more effective intervention because you have taken gender into account. So, for instance, definitely in terms of nutrition and maternal child health, if you're engaging men, you're going to have a better intervention. I would also say probably in agriculture it's the same. You just maybe don't have as much evidence about it, but
Right. It's building. But I think it's,
it's like your argument about the resilience side of things, or the resilience policy, or climate resilience, whatever it was.
Was it the environmental reg?
No, it was the climate. When you were saying that the governments have climate policies.
Oh, right.
Yeah, but they're not integrating gender into the policy.
But I mean, you may look at certain departments under the, ministries under the government where you have leadership that says, oh, actually we need to be thinking about this. Department of Health, Ministry of Health, where they say, well, we actually need to be thinking about these health components because these climate change pieces impact, what's happening. But that doesn't necessarily mean that actually goes into the climate change policy. So do we want to move on from this question? Let's move to the next. Oh, yeah. What resources are we using to define the gender context? Salud. And this is where it goes back to, we were talking about some of the resources before, but so I've listed here national policies, and we can use in-country staff as a resource because, well, they know about these policies and maybe have understood the how they've come into place, the background, and whether or not it's actually getting practiced, whether the policy is getting placed into everyday life, or is it just kind of a glossy document. World Bank data, there's actually this website here. I don't know if any people are familiar with this one, but it actually highlights okay, so this is focused on policies on women, business, and the law. So it can tell you what laws are in place in what countries. So let's go to Bangladesh. And it will tell you where these pieces are within. So, for example, does the Constitution contain a clause on non-discrimination? Yes, and this is where you can find it. Does it contain a clause on equality? Yes, and this is where you can find it. I feel like this is a website that I could get lost in for a very long time. Can a married woman apply for a passport in the same way as a married man? I would have never even think to ask that question. And that would be extremely helpful for a program if you're thinking about migration. I mean, there's a lot of migration that takes place with men and women. There's a lot of women who migrate out of Bangladesh, right?
And it's interesting because laws are formed based on social norms. So you can really understand what is happening in the country
Sure.
and the issues that happened in the country previously to lead up to that law being created.
I will send these links out to folks after this meeting, so you can play with them. But I think this is great in helping, like you said, to determine some of the social norms, but also, whether or not there may have been discussions about whether or not a policy has been put in place, but it actually hasn't been put in place.
Taking it down one level might not be a national level, but it might be like practices. Like, let's say if a woman applies for a loan at the bank, the bank might have their own policies, whether or not if the woman will need extra or additional collateral, or I know a lot of times for getting a bank loan, land is put up, their house is up for collateral. Well, if a woman in that country cannot own property, that's a problem to practice the loan. So it's not just the national policies, it's also the customs and business practices within the country. And not just formal business either, but informal businesses too.
I'm going to ask you for an example there. Do you have an
So,
example?
just like going to the market, are women allowed to buy and sell things in the market? Are women allowed to drive vehicles or farm equipment that allows them to harvest their fields to get to the market? So there's all the different things about, again, going back to gender roles, but again, also tied into do no harm. Like if you train, women growing tomatoes, well, will that then cause harm of the men tomato traders? So it's all tied together. It's a difficult topic, but anyway, I'm kind of.
No, it's okay. We welcome rambling in this environment because I think it helps us get deeper into some of these other pieces. And absolutely, it is all tied together.
So I guess going back to just a question of so a formal business would be a bank, right? An informal business would be an agribusiness trader along in the mid part of the value chain.
Right.
It might be registered as a business, it might not be. So those intermediaries, traders, are if they're predominantly used to dealing with men, and then all of a sudden you have a woman tomato farmer come up to them, they might be like, "Who are you?"
And I'm not going to do business with
Right.
you. There's nothing that says I have to do business with
Right.
you.
Or if they're Hindu and not Muslim, or all the different factors that we can relate to that.
Yeah, and See, I understand how. Where this is getting tricky because
It's all interconnected and tied.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
And I think also, when you talk about laws and policies as well, they're the ones that are traditional and unwritten, and that tend to be enforced by traditional leadership, as opposed to formal leadership. So things like land ownership and management, in some cases where land is managed traditionally, doesn't matter what the laws are, unless there's some kind of option to take. Now, if say the formal law is, the formal legal processes are in place to try and adjudicate those cases that would tend to be traditionally settled. So, for instance, several years ago, I was in Zambia, and it was kind of interesting for me to note that there was a widow who was owning land. And I said, well, isn't it the case, isn't that interesting that widow is owning land, because generally doesn't she have to give up the land to her husband's wives and relatives? And they said, well, these days you can take these cases to the magistrate and they will actually settle them in some places. So it's kind of interesting, sort of the interaction between the traditional and the formal is sometimes good to look at and to see. So nothing is necessarily cut and dried either, as far as either the formal law or the traditional law these days.
So I was looking at the next point on this in terms of how are we defining the gender context and, you know, who we're talking to about cultural norms in the program area. And it kind of brought me back to, okay, well, you know, when we're doing all this, or when is this actually happening? Well, you know, we kind of call it a gender assessment if we're doing it before the program. We may be doing some of this early work in prep for the gender analysis. But like you just said, Mara, that nexus of informal and formal laws, policies, practices is a really crucial one to hit upon, and it may be hard because we're starting at a point where we're looking at everything, you know, the gray literature and the policies that are written, and at the same time we're trying to get some of that information from the ground, from our staff, from beneficiaries, and that triangulation of data, so using primary and secondary resources to capture that. But it's time consuming and probably often falls strictly on a gender consultant or the gender advisor with the support. Does anybody have any cases where that information actually is collected by someone else, or does it really exclusively fall to a consultant, gender consultant or advisor?
Usually it's the gender advisor, although I would imagine that there's quite often sometimes it's hand in hand between the gender advisor and the M&E specialist, depending on what the level of the amount of work there is in it, the level of effort required.
Well, there was a time when, or it felt like there was a time when M&E advisors or M&E staff were being used as gender focal points. And it's probably happening still in certain programs because they don't have the money to hire a gender advisor, or there's no just
or gender analysis being included as part of the baseline,
right,
something like that.
Right. I think we're moving away from that now.
Yeah.
Would others agree, or do people still see that as a practice, or are there other people who are taking it?
It depends on the donor. It depends on the program. Because if you have a $2 million OSTA program, are you going to be able to hire a gender specialist full time on top of whoever else, unless you have other?
But I'm also seeing or hearing about SPC and gender being pulled together as well. I mean, you know, the way that I see it is, however it works, if someone has that expertise and you're able to pull that expertise, then I think that's great. But I'm not.
Yeah.
But it depends. If I feel like if they have, there's a difference between expertise and willingness.
Yeah. Well, kind of interestingly, in Mali, when we did our gender analysis, the Deputy Meal Manager helped the gender advisor, so supported that analysis. And we sometimes have different layers that we may have. We often have a gender advisor at the country office level, and we will have a gender advisor at the project level. This is care. And then we may bring in a consultant as well and have a gender TA at HQ who's supervising the whole thing. And then have others at the country office level who participate.
That's a lot of layers.
That's what we do at AP as well. We're currently helping with the gender analysis right now. We're coordinating it. And we have the consultant who was sent, and then we have the gender advisor in the field, and then on top of that we have the gender point of contact, Lydia, she's the local representative, the regional representative, and then we have the HQ point person as well.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of layers as well, which is great, and a lot of input, and and it allows us to have a more holistic understanding of the situation on the ground.
Although I would say, and this is kind of like maybe something to explore for the future, it would really be nice to see if it's possible from time to time to include some of the sector leads.
We do. We try to have them
Yeah.
participate in this because it is important and it needs to be incorporated in all components. We did ask for input from all of them.
I mean, just at least to review it, if
Yes.
nothing else. Yeah.
Okay, I have $1 million question associated with that, but I'm going to hold it for now because I think we can maybe get to that at the end. And that kind of feeds into the point about organizational policy and norms. So if the organizational norm is to have layers of people involved, and I don't know if, I guess layers is a good word because people are operating and they have a different set of responsibilities. And so when you kind of put them all together, then you kind of create this really cushy layer sticking of a pillow. Which kind of, yeah, anyways, I'm going to stop. But I think that plays a big role in how successful the process can be seen, but also the output, and then hence what you see beyond that. So if you have multiple layers that are involved in an assessment or analysis process, and it eventually needs to go back to the theory of change, since we want to get to that point about the theory of change, we know that as a result of having so many people, they're going to be cognizant of the fact that it needs to be linked to the theory of change, and therefore when you have more people making noise, the squeaky wheels, that's going to get taken care of. But in cases where I think there's less noise around that and how it needs, whatever the results are need to get thrown back into the theory of change is less likely to happen. Does anybody else have any points around organizational policies or norms? So I'll give an example. There have been some pieces around, reviewing some of the documents, like a position description, to see if there are those gender pieces included in the position descriptions. Does this person you're trying to hire, do they actually have some experience with gender integration? Is it mentioned in the position description that people will be held accountable for integrating gender? Does that say that in the HR policies? And then do people really at the program level, do they have an understanding of what this kind of the standard operating procedure is for the organization? Do they know that the organization has a gender policy? Have they read it? Is that part of their onboarding process? How many people on staff have actually been exposed to that? We know that the further away we get from headquarters level, the more difficult it is to kind of carry out some of that, and we have more influence of kind of the local environment playing into how an office or a program is run.
Well, I know from the CARE perspective that we do have all of those things, and we try to get them around the world to everybody. So when I go into just about any office in the CARE world, and I ask people, did you participate in the GED 101 and 102? They have. It's really amazing, or at least some of them have, maybe not all of them, but at least the key kind of top-level staff have. And I think it sets a really good tone, one that that's kind of unusual in terms of my experience. So, I'm just, that's one of the things I really like about CARE and about how we operate. I guess my only question is that an expectation that we can have that's going to exist elsewhere, everywhere, or is that something we want to see happen? Because I think it does set a tone. I think it does really get at what people, that people's hearts and minds are in it, as opposed to just this is their score sheet and this is what they're doing, and they're just doing it.
Well, we know no matter where we go, we're all a part of different organizations, and if I were to walk into the office or a field office of anyone, there is a different feeling that we get from being in that office. For example, I went into the Food for the Hungry office in Uganda just to pick up some dry erase board. And when you're in the office, you just get a feel for what their organizational culture is like and what's important to them. And the offices all kind of look the same, really, but you still get that sense when you walk through the door. There is that tone that is set. And so each one, for example, for Save the Children, we focus on children. That's a big focus for us. CARE has a huge gender focus. So every organization has that kind of piece that is a little bit different. So where does it, how does that gender, that tone and piece fit in? And I guess it's really hard. Even though you have the organizational piece, you still have the people piece in there as well, and the cultural piece in there as well. So it'll feel much different walking into an office in Latin America compared to, South Asia.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Well, one of the things that I see at CARE is the T-shirts that people wear. They're all saying things like, end GBV, I'm a man who supports the end of GBV, or something like that. The drivers are wearing that, like that's like part and parcel of the culture. That people are committing themselves to that gender equality, to this kind of, ethic or value. In Bangladesh, they may not wear T-shirts, it's not part of the culture, but you see or they're not wearing that, but there's a woman driver,
Right.
in Dhaka, which just like blew me away, and she's probably more, what should I say, gung-ho than a lot of the male drivers.
I got into a cab here in D.C. with a woman who was driving, and I was shocked because out of the, let's say 100 cabs that I've been in D.C., it's the only time I've ever had a female driver.
I've had some hesitancy once too. I was caught off guard.
Right.
I was like,
Right.
but I was like, wait, I shouldn't do
Well,
that.
there's a new app service that's Women for Women, so it's women driving women.
Here in D.C. or just
It's a new app.
It's a new app.
Launching soon, yeah.
So as I mentioned, I'm based out of Ohio, and I'm out of a local regional airport, and there was actually a big billboard sign saying, women, if you're looking for a female driver, call this number.
I think maybe it's already launched. It's the new app that's because of so much sexual assault that happened in Uber and Lyft. And you don't expect that either.
No.
You don't expect a woman driver, so it's interesting.
Right, but I certainly would feel, there have been times, I recently had a ride where I really was questioning, am I really going where I'm going? Because I don't know where I'm going. I don't know the roads, and I thought, what's my plan of action here? And I got there. I mean, I hate to be so doubtful of someone, but I just feel like I had to be prepared. Anyways, we're getting off. But in a sense, this all links back to the point we've talked about earlier too, is in the program tone. And what's the tone at HQ? What's the tone within the program? What's the tone within the country office? And ultimately, I think it does come back to people, and it goes back to this piece around who are we hiring. I mean, it's sometimes if we take the time to invest in our staff, like Mary mentioned, the gender equity and diversity training. There's that. We know that people change and transition and make positive changes, and I think that's true for all of us, not just this person or that person, but it's true for all of us. So we know that each one of these pieces can make a difference.
That's
I
why
guess-
it's so important. Sorry, Sarah.
I guess I just want to ask the question, though. How much should should there be an expectation that there be this kind of training or this kind of orientation for staff? And I guess that's, it's kind of at a different level, that question.
Right.
Sort of like, is that a policy level question that we should be pursuing?
When you mean training, do you mean people in the field training other people in the field, or do you mean someone from HQ going to the field and training the local staff?
Kind of both. But I think that, for instance, at CARE, we have this gender equity and diversity training. It's generally facilitated by HR. So it is like part of the onboarding, it's part of like the enculturation when you join CARE, whether it's here in BC or Atlanta or Bangladesh. You go through it. This is what you do. It's kind of normative that way. But the question is that something we should be seeing? And I leave that open. Because it works as far as I can see, but like, am I going to impose it? Is something I want to impose on other people?
I think that I agree, but I also, there's a caveat. So there's two parts. So one, I agree, because I feel like you can't practice what you don't believe, right? So if you are trying to have these local staff go out and train women or do whatever they need to do, but if they themselves, like in Kyrgyzstan, don't think there's a gender problem, well, then that's a problem. Like, if they don't believe it inherently, then they're not going to put their actions, their efforts towards reaching a goal that they don't believe in or see as valuable to even doing. On the flip side, though, just by having somebody go through an onboarding session or just by somebody reading a policy document does not mean that they're actually then going to believe that wholeheartedly. It's just check going through the motions. So some will, some won't, but just because you have it part of a standardized process or you ask people to, read the policies doesn't mean that they're actually going to then be on board with them. So that's the second part of it. So yes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to.
I still think there's value in letting them know this is what the organization
Of course.
stands for. So, yeah, even if they don't, I think there's, for everyone, there's things about the organization that they're I don't know about this, but you still have to let them know this is what is expected of you, and this is our stance on issues. That gives them, and if they really cannot get behind it, they can do something else, or they can grow towards it. But I think it's important still to put it out there.
Yeah. But the best way to really understand it before something is seeing it. So if you see an example or see how a specific tool or even gender in general can benefit the beneficiaries, then you're more likely to stand behind it and want to implement more of it. So sometimes it's not just, reading about a policy, but really seeing examples and learning as you go through the project.
I agree with all of
And that actually ties nicely into the whole theory of change, the whole, the learning element of it. It's like you can push staff and try to get them, to do something, but until they actually see it for themselves, to see the outcome of that training that incorporated women appropriately, like, oh, wow, this actually did help my technical activity and it should reach my targets, then they're going to do it more the next time.
And that's where gender audits are really useful, because it's also looking back at what the project has achieved thus far, and when rightfully so disseminated, it can help the staff comprehend the success they've had so far.
Let's flip to the next slide. The gender audit piece, I think, is, the whole assessment audit analysis. People are like, what? How do we do this? When do we do this first? How do we do this? And I think if you have those layers happening, then, you're able to identify, okay, we're seeing that this is lacking, or we don't know that this is happening. We know how that can actually come into play. Now, getting those layers into an organization is a completely different story, but I think that's when it becomes helpful to have a lot of people. Yeah, so the rhetorical question is, why do we need to understand the gender context as it relates to the program? And we all pretty much know why. There's lots of reasons why. But I'm kind of linking this back to the theory of change piece. And, you know, a lot of ongoing programs at the moment don't have theories of change. And I'm talking about Food for Peace programs in a written format, or in the format that is currently being used today. But my belief is that this theory of change process has actually occurred in people's heads. I mean, this is, you know, the problem trees, and, you know, there's been different means and tools and resources used to come up with some of these conclusions, and it's just kind of formalized theory of change that has developed in the past few years. How many? I know that I think within the past 2 years, I'm thinking about, that's when I've really seen some of these theories of change come into play. Is that about the timeline that everyone else has seen as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say like 2-3 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think, you know, once again, I think we're all, it's kind of, although we're developing them, we're building them, it's still, even for me, I've done several of them, I still find that I'm kind of not fuzzy. I'm still fuzzy about it, like how these things work and so forth.
Yeah, especially how it will work, like through the implementation.
Yeah.
We're supposed to revisit it, make the change, what all that looks like.
Because it's a process. It's not just everybody sitting at the table and saying, okay, we're going to knock this out in 2 hours and have a new theory of change to work with.
There's not ever going to be a theory of change in 2 hours.
Yeah, I find it's very,
not controversial, but people just have their very different beliefs about it and what it is and what it should look like, and you know, it's very difficult to get consensus.
But I think also when you're talking about, in general, your theory of change, I think you're really overall meaning a strategy. And the question is, and you're trying to get your activities out of it. So the question is, based on the context of what you know from the gender analysis, how can you either make your pathways within your theory or your strategy more effective, or eliminate things that will impede it? So understanding those elements are really important, but it's also the case that you have to kind of set expectations realistically as well. You may find within the context that you may not have too many leverage points to change things like gender-based violence. What can you expect to do based on the context? Who are the positive drivers that you can work with on that? Where are the opportunities and where are the constraints? Because you have to really look at it realistically so you know what you can.
So one of my little hang-ups I have about theory of change, this is me, I have all sorts of little oddities and quirks. But one of the hang-ups that I have around theory of change after being in a country office and watching a program try and work through it together as a group is thinking about how, first of all, how much language plays a role. But also, people, we all grew up in a context and are taught a certain path how we develop ideas and things, right? So sometimes there's this whole circular thing going on, and sometimes there's this linear thing going on, and I'm sure there's lots of other ways that I don't even understand how people derive, come up with their conclusions. And so I struggle with theory of change because to me it's so structured in a way that I feel that the process can impede the kind of learned means of thinking that certain countries or cultures have. That's my little struggle point with the theory of change, and even maybe how even we think about it as well. Is there a way that we think about it, or it could be presented to make it less fuzzy? Because I have the fuzziness around kind of how we go about getting, and just generally speaking, we're all sitting in the same room, but we all think differently anyways and arrive at conclusions in a different way. So my struggle with the theory of change is how we actually build it, the process that we take. And I don't know if, and I'm sure even within our own organizations, we have different processes for arriving at what comes out on paper, what we submit to the donor. And then how that is shared with staff is a completely different thing too. And then if we talk about how are we putting gender into it, do most people find that it's kind of being thrown in as a cross-cutting theme? Do others find that it's falling in within, one of their purposes? Or is it really being considered in a lot of the boxes?
Very through projects. I've worked on 6 projects, and every single project that I work on has different reports that are completely different from one another. Some of them just shove gender into a little box, and then others have it throughout. So really,
So is that do you think that's by donor design or by, it's not the organization, because if the organization had a standard design, if they said, we're just going to make it cross-cutting, then it would be cross-cutting, right? But I guess if a donor says, well, we want it this way, or depending on who actually the person who designs the program.
Or maybe even just who writes the report.
I think it's mostly who writes the report.
Yeah. But quite frankly, it's interesting because coming back from the M&E workshop with Grande, what happened was that we had 30 kind of lead advisors for, from the project. So technical leads, plus some of the leadership from the partners. And it was like, let's see, how many days was it? 8 days. It started off as a classic M&E workshop, and then we started looking at some of the results from a number of different assessments, including the gender analysis. And then we looked at how to integrate those things into the theory of change. And they basically pulled apart the theory of change, put it back together again, and made it their own based on the findings. To some extent based on the findings, and to some extent based on their experience and how they felt things would work and so forth. I think, quite frankly, that was a great process because it got the staff to learn it and to know it better, and to really be the authors of it as opposed to somebody else coming in and telling them what to do. Now, did it change drastically? No, it didn't. There were, however, many changes, and there were changes in emphasis and focus and tone. And part of that evolved from things like the gender analysis, but there were a lot of other things that came into play. Youth analysis, value chain analysis, all these climate change, vulnerability capacity assessment, and so forth. But also all those analyses had gender focus in them as well. So that meant that you could pull from whatever your sector assessment was, and the gender findings were included. So the gender findings fed into the theory of change.
So let me ask, how often, linked to that, knowing that there are these different pieces where gender is included, and thinking about how it feeds into the theory of change, it goes back to another question, the fuzzy question around how often does all this get updated or reviewed or modified? Is that based off of donor expectations? is it based off of, or donor due dates, I should say? Is it based off of a process that each organization develops or each program develops in order to say annually we're going to revisit this? I mean, I know that, with Food for Peace, it's changing. I think there's going to be requirements around submitting updated. I mean, who knows? Yeah, I mean, I think it's different in many different contexts, just given the age of the program. But I mean, how does that happen?
I don't think if it's not written into the proposal and therefore not into the cooperative agreement or contract, I don't think it's going to happen. So I'll give you two different examples. The one, both with students actually. So the first project that has since ended, it was a women's only project, and it had a specific theory of change. It had a nice little graphic, but it was a learning project. So we actually met with other similar programs implemented by different partners, and we had like a learning network. And so we revisited our theories and our, I guess at the time guesses about how the project would progress, right? So we had that built into the whole project design from the beginning. The current curriculum project that I'm working with now has gender more as a cross-cutting theme. And there was not integrated to the proposal and therefore the contract about how to ever revisit gender or revisit that whole theory of change part. There's no graphic, there's really nothing. It's just gender is kind of scattered throughout.
Right.
I mean, same organization, we do have organizational gender policy, we do have a gender advisor,
Right.
but the way it was written, the way that what the donor asked for, it's just really, it really depends. So the first example is the Women's Only project that was funded out of DC, and then the second one is now is the mission funded. So, that also can play a role.
I think, with Food for Peace, there's kind of this expectation that you review it annually, but
I would say that's new, though. 'Cause
yeah,
even
that
like
is new.
with the
But then
MIAS
people were
that
asking us,
still
well,
has-
how often are you going to review this? And I don't think we ever discussed it as part of our workshop. I was like, yeah, we need to discuss that as part of our workshop. We never really did.
So, in other words, is it in work plans?
To review the theory of change? I don't think so, and I think we're going to have to probably put it in,
Yeah, I think
at some point, at least around the time of maybe the annual prep, because that's when you're going to be determining your directions for the coming year. If you need to make a drastic change or you're learning something that's coming out you need to address, then you put it in. But year to year, I could not see major changes taking place unless we do a study and we find out we're going in the wrong direction.
Like a midterm evaluation.
Yeah. A midterm evaluation would be a good time.
Gender analysis may also be a time
But
when...
the gender analysis is done in the first year. So if you have everything front-loaded in the first year and you have everything coming in, then you can do it right at the end of the first year.
A contextual change may also cause, so if there was a conflict or some type of...
Yeah. Like interestingly with Haiti, so there's this whole back and forth today looking at, so we have a DFAP in Haiti. We're getting a modification to address the hurricane. Okay, so then it's like all these people coming back and forth saying, why don't we have a new project, and everything. And it's like, no, it doesn't work that way. You have to be able to respond. But I realize it's not in the proposal to respond to, it's not in our project. There's nothing in our project. There's no component in our project to respond to emergencies. Despite the fact that it's discussed, there isn't a response component. And I said, okay, create another component, SO5,
Chloe, did you have something to add?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, I think it is a lot, especially when you look at DFAP, it is very donor-driven. I mean, I'm just thinking, like, when I started working on these, 2011, when they were MIAS, and, like, we didn't even really have to include a theory of change, and then, like, a year or two later, we did need a theory of change, but it could be just a simple graphic, and there wasn't even like there's not too much like our Zimbabwe. I think it's but like yeah, like it has like a really very simple like I think the graphic is like a house of building blocks or something, and that was totally fine for theory of change. And then like now it's very extensive spreadsheets
we
with
have these ones,
long text and
we have these ones at CARE that are like, this plus this times that equals.
Right. And that's our theory of change. And that was, but that was fine at the time. So I think that
No, we don't. We still use those internally. Like I show people our theories of change. They go, "Are you kidding?"
Well, one might say that something could be good,
But
one might argue that. But that's not where we are.
I like simple. I do like sometimes you can say more with less.
I might agree with you on that. But so I think that as like Food for Peace is demanding more of them, like giving more direction on what they want it to look like and even like the format, and then so I think we are really following that we So if but also say for the how often it's revisited, probably as often as they would like us to revisit it. Because I mean, there's just so much going on with programs. Obviously, we want it to be done well, and like you do, like every time you do like annual data collection, you look at the ARRs, like you do look to see how well the program is going, but that's just another layer. That's just more time. Theory of change is not simple. A lot of time that you have to.
Well, let's move on to the next. I think the next one might be the last one. How will having info? Oh, right. How will having info on the gender context help in the gender analysis process? So I guess the way that I kind of envision things happening in this perfect world is, if I and I'll be organization X decides that I'm going to go after a Food for Peace project, or it could be any project really in the future. And I already have a country presence. Well, I already have an idea of what the gender context is like. And then if I know that there's going to be this RFA, then, ideally I've already completed this beautiful gender assessment ahead of the RFA even coming out. But the reality is, in many cases, that there's some prep that happens, but a gender assessment doesn't necessarily take place ahead of the program. It's kind of this very rapid analysis that's done because people are stretched. And then once the RFA comes out, sure, then it's responsive to whatever is said in the RFA or RFP. And then from there, it is really driven by whatever process the donor would like to take. That's not true for everyone. Every organization is different. I think especially those that have dedicated staff to integrating gender. But for some people, really, the gender analysis process is started by taking a look at the gender context. It's not the road we'd like to take, but I think that's a road that's often taken just due to resource constraints. But we know that if we're able to have all this information ahead of time, it just puts us that much further ahead of the curve in terms of the program design and the theory of change design. I'm curious, is that how, I see nods in the room, but is that how it happens? Do we, are there other examples of where organizations really are doing that? I think it'd be great if it was true, but I mean, I don't know how often that really is happening based on resource and time constraints.
I think it ties back to our previous discussion, because I think the body of knowledge that would have that information readily available would be the past and existing projects. But because they don't have outputs that describe the theory of change that they've been working on, it's like the projects, that when you're writing a proposal and doing your gender analysis, you're kind of starting from ground zero again, right? That's at least been my experience, is that unless the current organization has a current project in that country that has those resources, information is lost. And I don't know if it's just ACD Avoca, we have bad institutional memory, but we do.
Oh, no.
Not
Or
even-
follow on.
not
If you have
even-
follow on,
right.
then it works.
That's
But
a
not
real,
even-
that's a real
Yeah.
problem overall because we tend to be so projectized. I mean, at CARE, we're trying to get away from that by varying our funding sources and so forth, but it still happens. We wind up having chiefs of party who are there for the project, and when the project's over, the chief of party leaves, and leaves with all the jewels in his or her head.
Well, an issue that I stumbled upon in the Leo conference that we had was a lot of the times we do this great work at having indicators, collecting this data during a project, and then the project ends 5 years later, and the data you don't really do anything with it until a lot of the data, especially around gender, takes time to understand, and it takes time to actually see the effect of it. So unless after the 5 years of the project runs, unless someone picks it up and continues with it, then collecting that data for 5 years is completely useless. And you don't actually see the aftermath of what the project actually tried to accomplish in regards to gender. So there is that disconnect that needs to be addressed somehow. And during Leo, we tried to talk about this, and there was no solution. There was no actual...
And I think it's the very nature of how the international development programs are based. I mean, they're 3, 4, 5-year projects, and then even if they have follow-on, they can be implemented by the same organization or by different organizations. Again, the reporting and the M&E collection is very tied to program deliverables in that time period. It doesn't have that long-term, actually, how are we changing the context? Right? There's no continuity.
There are some things that you can see results right away, and that's great. But for gender, especially, it's really hard to, in 3, 4, 5 years, to see the result right there and then. So that's where I think also...
So tying back to your question, so I think that because of that, I think that is why traditionally, when there's an RFA out, okay, time to do the gender analysis, time to do the desk research, time to dig up reports from wherever you can find them. You start from scratch, and that shouldn't be the case.
In fact, like at CARE, we're so bad. We don't have capacity statements for all of our country offices. So we're often trying to, as soon as we find out there's something, pushing, the country office starts hiring interns to do their capacity statements. They're so far behind the ball.
But I don't think that CARE is the only organization that's that issue.
No.
I mean, seriously, it takes forever for these capacity
Ow.
I mean, that was my first internship when you save the children in Beijing doing that. So, the thing is, there isn't also a sharing platform for gender. And as naive as this could sound, perhaps it would be great to have a place where gender groups of different organizations could share their gatherings and their information from different countries.
So, okay, so let's go on to the next, Lauren, let's go on to the next slide. We should be getting to this one about, there we go. So I think this is interesting. It's interesting that you brought this up because we have lots of resources available where there are pools of information, but yet it's still not enough. So I want to go off this idea of, some type of portal for having this information. I mean, what is the information that, I'm going to pull up each one of these. I don't know how,
I don't think that
I think we're not. I'm just going to throw
So
it.
for me, what's missing here is this is the high-level aggregate. Even if it can get down into the details too, I can take an example, women's income level or something, for example. But
Right.
that data is not necessarily what you're looking for in analysis. In analysis, you want the contextualized stories, the contextualized knowledge that the previous project or another donor or somebody has on the ground, right? And that only usually can happen through reports, international development project reports or success stories, or just things like of that nature. And those are not captured, right? Because there's no area to put that information in. There's no space to do that. And historically, organizations don't collaborate in that way. A very competitive environment, understandably so. But are we shooting ourselves in the foot here?
Okay, so I pulled up a couple of these pieces. So yeah, this is exactly it. This is data, right? Data,
Right.
women's stats is data. But what's interesting about some of the data that women's stats have is it kind of looks a little more it looks at some of the more unique. I'm not going to be able to pull it up because I'm not in the code book right now, but it looks at some of the more dynamic relationships rather than just saying, do women own land?
Yeah.
But it still doesn't get at that piece that you're talking about, contextualizing.
Mm-hmm.
World Bank is another one that has, you can look at all sorts of data, and wow, that's a lot of data right there. The World Bank did just come out with this little data book of gender, and I think it's, again, a little more, I'm trying to see, it really is just data. Although, looking at this, there's just a lot of data there. I'm wondering if, and close. Valuable in its own sense of when you're doing that contextual background, you're able to pull, you get the numbers because you have to show the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, though, if this website gets at a little more of that contextualized data. And this is from the CG system. So they have data sets, and but they also focus on, it seems like they kind of bring in that more, here they say qualitative research.
Case studies. Yeah, on the right side.
Right.
Gender case studies.
Right.
Gender is reading.
So
They're
they're talking about livestock.
I hope it's livestock reading.
That's really important.
So they're talking about livestock.
Hey, wait a minute. When I was at Land O'Lakes, we found out that women that a very new kind of livelihood for women, where they're doing an excellent job, is artificial insemination. That women are twice as effective in inseminating cattle than men. They only have to go once rather than visit twice, which is on average what needs to do with men. Really interesting. Men find that very strange because they're the ones who are usually inseminating.
Right.
It's really interesting. I wonder if the animal can sense whether it's a woman or a man.
My parents are farmers and they do pigs, and there was a big study, and it was the same thing. So the women have this more calming, like that just they're more calming than, so like the demeanor is different. I love those.
And
we
the
have
pigs
expertise
respond.
in the room.
So the pigs just respond.
Yeah.
Differently.
Yeah. Wow.
So don't knock it.
I just clicked on this case study piece right here, and you can see that they've highlighted. They have a lot of, wow, that's a pretty big coverage area there in West Africa. 85, got 2 over here, but that's a big coverage area. So this website may be hitting at some of that more contextual. And then there was this other one here with the humanitarian. Well, and if anybody has any more, feel free to send them to me, or we can mention them here, but I will send this information out.
It's more statistics, but I always like DHS.
It's actually good.
You got it. Okay, that's a big, okay, then I'll go back here so we can look
Let's finish it out. Yeah.
Another one. I didn't need Department of Homeland Security. No, block that location. DHS surveys. I don't know the website. Oh, it's just DHS. Is it DHS? Oh, yeah, it is. Okay, so it's dhsprogram.com. And I never knew a lot about DHS surveys because I don't do a lot of work in health. I come from a natural resource ag background, but I didn't realize how these are really rigorous. It's very, I think it's very, compared to agriculture, it's so much easier to compare health practices.
Well, they measure everything consistently.
Right.
And exactly.
Right. And they have a lot of information, but DHS definitely has a lot of good information in terms of the nutrition and health pieces, right? Making sure. Because I don't actually use them. Does it have wash?
And then it also will have, it
Yeah.
has some wash in it, and
It
also
has
like
GBV.
marital practices, GBV.
Yeah, the classic question, under what circumstances is it justifiable to hit a woman
Right.
and to beat a woman, and they ask questions about men and women.
Are there any others? I think the next piece of this, I was thinking about a theory of change resource, but it's a little bit different than how Food for Peace does their theory of change stuff. But I think it'll be interesting to use during the next kind of mini workshop that we have on this. And that one is related to child marriage, and just kind of goes back to that simplified version. But of course, that's just one piece. When we talk about theories of change in a lot of our programming, we're talking about lots of different programming pieces. So, so on that note, I'm going to go ahead and conclude this particular workshop, and just note that we will follow up with the resources that are mentioned here. We'll make the recording available for people. It may be something they want to listen to when they're working out or on a commute or something, but we'll also start to think about what it is we want to have included in the next workshop on theory of change. If you have ideas about pieces that you really want to talk about, we're open to hearing them now, or you can send me your ideas. But we want to make sure that we're addressing the pieces that people want to know about.
One that just came off the top of my head would be maybe best practices and how to conduct gender analysis. And I know we kind of touched on a little bit about the resources here, but actually like going through the steps of if you had to conduct one, which is, best practices actually doing one.
Now I have to go back to the question. I can't remember where. I think that's question number. Okay, no, actually, that doesn't actually come in here, but we could make like a little inclusion of 2.5 because it jumps from these. So these are the 4 questions that's guiding this series. So the number 2 is what do you need to know about gender issues that could affect project activity, implementation, participation, and outcomes. And then we jump to what did you learn from the gender analysis, but we don't actually talk about how it is that we do a gender analysis. And there are different ways of going about it, and some people are some organizations are a bit more set on how they go about that process, I think for the sake of having some consistency across programs. But different people come from different backgrounds and have different experiences, and of course it all depends if you have a small program with one partner that's doing it, or if you're trying to, I'm thinking of one particular case, have multiple people, multiple organizations involved in a gender analysis process, that could become a little more complicated. So that could be something that we look at in terms of a 2.5.
For me, having like I have health background and stuff like that, and having been in Peace Corps, I have some first-hand experience in gender, but not the actual kind of programmatic aspect or understanding behind it. So it would be great for me too to just get a general 101 on kind of the best practices or how to go about it.
Of the
of like
gender.
of the analysis.
Okay. Oh. Okay.
Yeah. Not of like gender itself, but like the gender analysis process.
Okay. Okay.
So just going off of
Right.
a continuation that not only for her but for me as well. I think it would be. I
Out
would
of
agree with that.
curiosity, ACDI VOCA has an actual manual on how to carry out gender analysis and assessment. Does Save the Children and CARE and other organizations have that physical document too, or?
I'm familiar with the ACDI VOCA resource. We actually have it on the Epicen network. And I think each organization has different versions of it. Some of them I think are a bit more internal than others.
Okay, I've seen your manual. Ours is not to that level. We just have like internal
Save the Children it tends a little more internal, and it's very specific to, like, for example, the ACDI VOCA one focuses more on markets and ag. The one for Save the Children tends to lean more towards our programming areas, which are child protection, health, nutrition, education, livelihood. But more kind of like, I guess, yeah, it focuses really on those areas. And it talks about the general process, but again, it's a little less publicized. I know Mercy Corps has some resources. Some are more program specific. CARE has all sorts of resources on all sorts of topics.
They actually have some really good gender and climate change things that have come out this year. If you're interested, I'm trying to, so I'm part of this gender and climate, gender and resilience working group.
Mm.
That's kind of just come up, just started. And Kathleen Salvaggio, right? You were at the last meeting.
Online, yeah.
Yeah, is facilitating that for Mercy Corps, but CARE is also going to kind of co-chair because she's based in Portland. So I'm kind of in a kinship with her, but when I sit down, I'm going to try to pull together sort of the compendium of all of our gender climate resources that we have available, but we also have a lot of other gender things.
CARE internally,
Yeah.
you have a lot of resources.
Tons of them. I don't even know what we've got. I mean, I would need like help from somebody to go through all of it.
Because there's CARE USA, but then there's others that country offices might have produced,
Yeah.
and then
CARE International is
Right.
produced, and so even just on the climate change side, it's going to take, a couple hours to actually go through and get everything. Because there's a separate climate change site, CARE Climate Change. So they're on there. They're in, other documents that we have. It's wild.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking about what we have on the FSN network, and I just recently went through and looked through all the resources, and the resources either they seem to be really narrow, focusing on something very specific, or they're very, even looking at the ACDI VOCA guidance, you could apply a lot of that to other programs as well.
Yeah.
Health or whatever. It's nice to have that sector-specific guidance. I think about some of the PEPFAR guidance, and you look at, they have GBB guidance within there and steps and processes, and that information, it doesn't necessarily have to be a program targeting HIV/AIDS, but you have that information in there that's useful. But as an Aggie, I would never look at that. Why would I look at that? But it definitely is helpful. So there's that, while there is that specificity within those very specific technical documents that's useful, there certainly are pieces that could be pulled out. And I feel that's the way with ACDI VOCA manuals. Even that little, what is it, that like the 10 points on 10 pieces, like 10 points to remember when, is it hiring a consultant or bringing someone on?
How to carry out the gender
Maybe it's how, yeah, is that what it is, how to carry it out?
Yeah, they have a very synthesized pages within, and also the tools at the end.
Right.
think when reading the assessment, that was the most relevant part for me, was where it's not really prescribing the best tool, but here are the tools that you could use and actually demonstrating them.
Right. So, yeah, I think that there's an endless number of tools, but it just, some people are like, well, this really isn't an updated document. Sometimes the old stuff's kind of good to go. But it goes back to the knowledge management piece as well.
Yeah.
Let's not recreate the wheel. Out of that.
I think one workshop you might want to do at some point, and not structured around this, but just a separate kind of open session, would be that everybody sits down and does the document dump and talks about some of the key things that they always use, some of the things they sometimes is good for certain things, and things that they've tried to use and they're just not really helpful. And that might be a good way to kind of give you some pointers on your library for the future.
And that's what I'm curious in terms of these resources. Do people go to Women's Stats and use it? Do they go to the World Bank and use that? No. What are
World Bank data is always really lacking. Whenever I look in, when you actually, it looks great as you saw when you open it. You're like, oh, pretty graph and all this documented information. But when you actually go and open up the data and try to analyze it, there's so much missing information, and there's so many truncated data sets. So it's really, I don't personally find it useful. So I think that the numbers are just nice plugs for reports. Say, hey, we tackled this much.
I think I haven't used the gender CGIR, but I think that looks really good. And CHS I've always used, but so you're going to have to check out the gender CGIR.
Sometimes just do random Google searches for donor government gender analyses. Because like those are helpful. And like sometimes USAID has them, or sometimes Diffie does, sometimes Germany has them, CEDA. So, but it's hit or miss.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If you can find a gender analysis that's actually been done by the country itself, like that one in Rwanda, that's amazing. If you can find that.
Yes.
you going to send a link to that?
What is
it?
I have to
What
look
is
it
it?
up again. Okay, yeah.
Well, what is it online? Is it the Ministry of
I
Ag
think
one you're
so,
talking
yeah.
about?
I think so. It might be. If not, I can send it around. I think I have the hard copy. There you go. And they have it. They did their strategy too.
Oh, it's a little slow here. What to say?
Probably a big one. There you go.
Great.
All right. They did the gender analysis. Now they've done the gender strategy.
So we'll leave it at that. Okay, so we're at 3:01. I want to be respectful of people's time. Okay, so we'll send out resources. If you're really inclined to listen to this, we'll send out the recording. Take a listen. We will be binding some of the pieces from this to form the theory of change mini workshop, and we'll be sending out information on that. It will probably be at the beginning of November. So if you're not in town, you're on vacation, something comes up, you can't make it, we will have a call in and it will be recorded. But we will look at doing some of these other ones, like the 2.5 gender analysis process. How to. So thanks everybody for your participation. It was a really fruitful discussion.